In early 1981, a Pentagon analyst named David Mitchell reported to the FBI that he and his home were under surveillance by Soviet intelligence. By September, that conviction drove him to destroy his family, end his career, and land him in a psychiatric institution where he would spend the rest of his life convinced that foreign operatives were still watching him, still closing in, still waiting to strike. The FBI would investigate 17 separate reports made by David over 7 months. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. David was fighting an enemy that existed nowhere else but inside his own mind. David Mitchell was 37 years old, a senior logistics analyst at the Pentagon who had worked at the Department of Defense for 8 years. He'd grown up in Richmond, Virginia, the son of a career Army officer and a homemaker, and had served as an Army logistics officer during the tail end of the Vietnam War, coordinating supply operations from a base in South Korea. After completing his service in 1973, he'd been recruited by the Department of Defense for civilian work, analyzing procurement contracts and tracking equipment deliveries. His security clearance gave him access to sensitive supply chain data and procurement information related to military operations, nothing classified enough to make him a high-value intelligence target, but significant enough that his position carried weight. He lived with his wife, Karen, a paralegal who worked at a law firm in downtown Washington, and their 9-year-old daughter, Emily, in a 3-bedroom colonial house in Alexandria, Virginia. By every measure, the Mitchells were ordinary. They paid their bills on time, attended church occasionally, and maintained friendships with neighbors. David's colleagues at the Pentagon described him as competent, reserved, and friendly. He did his job well, but mostly kept to himself, and never caused any problems. There was nothing in his life, professional or personal, that would have attracted the attention of foreign intelligence services. And yet, in February of 1981, something shifted in his perception of the world around him. And that shift would set in motion a cascade of events that would destroy everything he'd built. On the morning of February 19th, 1981, David Mitchell walked into the Washington field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and told the agent at the reception desk that he needed to report a national security concern. He explained to the intake agent that for the past 3 weeks he had observed what he believed to be systematic surveillance of his movements. He'd noticed the same vehicle, a dark sedan with Virginia plates, parked near his office entrance at the Pentagon on 5 separate occasions. He'd seen a man in business attire standing at the metro station near his home on 3 consecutive mornings, always in the same spot, always appearing to watch the commuters, and always looking away when Mitchell made eye contact. He'd received 2 phone calls at his office where no one spoke, just silence, followed by a click and a disconnection. Mitchell came across as calm, articulate, and methodical. He had brought a notebook containing dates, times, and descriptions of each incident he'd observed. His handwriting was neat and organized. His demeanor was serious, but not panicked. He explained that he understood how this might sound, that he wasn't prone to paranoia or overreaction, but that given his position at the Pentagon and the current geopolitical climate, he felt obligated to report what he'd seen. The agent thanked him for coming in, told him the Bureau would look into his concerns, and said someone would be in touch. That afternoon, 2 counterintelligence agents were assigned to investigate Mitchell's report. The Cold War in 1981 was entering a new phase of tension. Ronald Reagan had taken office in January, bringing with him a harder line against the Soviet Union and a renewed focus on military readiness and intelligence operations. The KGB was active in Washington, operating under diplomatic cover, and the FBI's counterintelligence division was constantly working to identify and monitor Soviet operatives. In that environment, a report from a Pentagon employee claiming surveillance couldn't be dismissed outright, even if the employee in question wasn't handling classified material. Over the next 10 days, agents conducted surveillance near Mitchell's home and workplace, ran checks on the vehicle he'd described, and reviewed call logs at the Pentagon. They found no evidence of surveillance, no pattern of vehicles, no individual matching Mitchell's description of the man at the metro, no indication that anyone, foreign or domestic, was paying particular attention to David Mitchell. On March the 2nd, the lead agent called Mitchell and informed him that the investigation had not substantiated his concerns, but that he should continue to report any additional suspicious activity. Mitchell thanked the agent and hung up, but the absence of findings didn't ease the knot of anxiety that had been growing in his chest. The car had been there. He'd seen it. He'd documented it. So was the man. He saw him multiple times. Just because the FBI couldn't find proof didn't mean it hadn't happened. It meant whoever was watching him was better at concealment than the Bureau was at detection. At home, Karen Mitchell had begun to notice changes in her husband's behavior. He'd always been somewhat anxious, someone who planned ahead and worried about details, but over the past month, his anxiety had intensified into something darker. He'd started checking the locks on the doors multiple times before bed. He'd begun looking out the windows more frequently, scanning the street as if searching for something. He'd stopped talking about work in any detail, telling Karen that he couldn't discuss certain things over the phone or even at home, because he wasn't sure who might be listening. When Karen asked what was going on, David told her he couldn't explain everything yet, but that he needed her to trust him, that there were things happening that she didn't understand, and that he was handling it. Karen didn't know what to make of this. Her husband had never been paranoid, he'd never been irrational, but the way he was acting, the things he was saying, it all felt wrong. She considered calling his doctor, or maybe talking to his supervisor at the Pentagon. But David had made her promise not to discuss his concerns with anyone, and she didn't want to betray his trust. So she waited, hoping that whatever was bothering him would pass, that he'd calm down and return to normal. On March 18th, Mitchell filed his second report with the FBI. He called the Washington field office and reported that his home phone line had been compromised. Over the past week, he'd experienced unusual activity on the line, clicks and pops when he picked up the receiver, and on 2 occasions, a faint hissing sound that he believed was consistent with an active wiretap. He'd contacted the phone company, and a technician had come to the house to inspect the line. The technician had found no issues with the equipment and confirmed the line was functioning normally. But Mitchell was certain the line had been tapped, and he told the FBI that Soviet intelligence had the technical capability to install wiretaps that were undetectable by standard telephone company equipment. The FBI opened a second investigation. They coordinated with the phone company to conduct a more thorough examination of Mitchell's line, checking for signs of electronic interception or unauthorized access. They found nothing. The line was clean. No wiretap, no interference, no evidence of tampering. On March 24th, Mitchell received a call from the Bureau, informing him that the investigation had concluded with no findings, and once again, he was told to continue reporting any concerns. Over the next 4 months, David Mitchell filed 12 more reports with the FBI through late July, followed by 2 final reports in August and early September, bringing the total to 17. On April 9th, he reported that someone had entered his house while the family was away. He'd returned home from work to find the back door unlocked, even though he was certain he'd secured it that morning. Inside, small items had been moved. A lamp on the side table was at a different angle. A book on the coffee table had been turned over. The kitchen chairs had been repositioned slightly. Karen insisted she hadn't moved anything, and Emily had been at school all day. Mitchell told the FBI that the intrusion was deliberate, designed to let him know he was being watched without leaving obvious evidence. Agents came to the house, dusted for fingerprints, and found nothing. No signs of forced entry. No evidence that anyone had been inside. On May 3rd, Mitchell reported that his car had been tampered with. He'd found the gas cap slightly loose and noticed what he thought were scratches near the fuel tank opening. He believed someone had attempted to place a tracking device inside the tank or near the undercarriage. A mechanic inspected the vehicle and found no evidence of tampering. No tracking devices, no scratches that weren't consistent with normal wear. On May 21st, Mitchell reported seeing the same individual, a man in his 40s, with dark hair and a grey jacket, at multiple locations: outside a coffee shop near the Pentagon, outside a grocery store in Alexandria, standing near the playground at his daughter's elementary school. Mitchell provided detailed descriptions and approximate times. FBI agents conducted interviews and followed up with local police about the individual near the school and found no evidence of suspicious activity. On June 14th, Mitchell reported that his mail was being intercepted and examined. Several envelopes had arrived with what appeared to be signs of tampering, small cuts along the seams and adhesive that looked like it had been reapplied. He brought the envelopes to the FBI office for forensic examination. The analysis revealed no evidence of tampering. The damage was consistent with normal postal handling. Each report was investigated with the same thoroughness as the first. Each time, the FBI found nothing. No surveillance, no tampering, no foreign operatives. And each time Mitchell was informed of the results, he accepted them on the surface, but privately remained convinced that the lack of evidence was itself evidence of how sophisticated the operation against him had become. At the Pentagon, Mitchell's colleagues had started to notice his behavior changing. He'd become more withdrawn, more secretive. He'd stopped eating lunch in the cafeteria with other analysts, preferring to eat alone at his desk or in his car. He'd begun asking unusual questions during meetings, questions about security protocols, about who had access to certain areas of the building, about whether anyone had noticed unfamiliar faces in the corridors. His supervisor, a man named Colonel Frank Barrett, later told investigators that Mitchell had seemed increasingly stressed, but still functional, and at the time, Barrett had attributed it to the pressures of the job and the political climate under the new administration. But by July, Mitchell's behavior had crossed a line that made people uncomfortable. He'd been found going through trash bins in his office area, claiming he was checking to see if anyone was searching through his discarded documents. He'd accused a co-worker of asking too many questions about his work, suggesting the co-worker might be trying to gather information for a foreign service. The co-worker reported the accusation to security, and Mitchell was called in for a meeting with his supervisor and a Pentagon security officer. During the meeting, Mitchell calmly explained that he'd been experiencing what he believed to be systematic surveillance for several months, that he'd reported everything to the FBI, and that while the Bureau hadn't found concrete evidence yet, he remained certain that he was a target. The security officer asked if Mitchell felt he was in danger. Mitchell said he didn't know, but that he was being careful. The meeting ended with a recommendation that Mitchell take some time off to rest, and while it wasn't mandatory, the implication was clear. Mitchell didn't take time off. He told Karen that leaving work would be exactly what they wanted, that it would signal weakness, that it would give them an opening. Karen didn't understand who they were, and when she asked, David became evasive, saying only that she needed to trust him, that he was protecting the family, that everything he was doing was necessary. On July 28th, Mitchell called the FBI and reported that he'd discovered a listening device in his home. He'd been conducting his own search of the house, he explained, going through rooms methodically, and he'd found a small electronic component behind an outlet cover in the living room. He'd carefully removed the cover with a screwdriver and photographed the component with a camera he'd purchased specifically for documentation purposes. He told the agent on the phone that he hadn't touched the device beyond the removal, that he understood the importance of preserving evidence, and that he needed agents to come immediately to examine and remove it. 2 agents arrived within the hour. Mitchell led them to the outlet and showed them the component he'd found. One agent removed it carefully and held it up to the light. It was a standard capacitor, a routine piece of electrical hardware found in most household wiring systems, completely mundane and entirely innocent. The agent explained this to Mitchell, showing him how the component was integrated into the outlet's internal circuit, how it served a basic electrical function, and how it could not possibly be a listening device. Mitchell stared at the component for a long time, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. Then he nodded slowly and said that perhaps he'd been mistaken about that particular component, but that the house was still compromised, and the real devices were simply better hidden than he'd thought. The agents exchanged a look. One of them asked Mitchell if he was feeling all right, if he was under a lot of stress, if maybe he wanted to talk to someone about what he was experiencing. Mitchell said he was fine, that he just needed the Bureau to take his reports more seriously, that Soviet intelligence was sophisticated and everyone was underestimating the threat. The agents left shortly after, and in their report, they noted that Mitchell appeared increasingly agitated and fixated, and that his inability to accept contradictory evidence suggested a psychological issue that was beyond the FBI's scope to address. By August, David Mitchell had stopped going to work. He'd called in sick repeatedly, and after 2 weeks of absence, Colonel Barrett had contacted him at home to check on him. Mitchell had told Barrett he couldn't come in yet, that there were security concerns he needed to address, and that he'd return when the situation was resolved. Barrett had tried to get more information, but Mitchell had been vague and evasive, and eventually Barrett had no choice but to place him on administrative leave, pending a fitness for duty evaluation. At home, Mitchell's behavior had become obsessive. He'd covered several windows with aluminum foil, claiming it would block electronic surveillance. He'd stopped using the telephone for anything other than essential calls, and when he did use it, he spoke in vague, coded language. He'd installed additional locks on every door, heavy-duty deadbolts that he secured multiple times throughout the day. He'd begun sleeping in different rooms each night, convinced that establishing a predictable pattern would make him vulnerable. He'd started keeping a detailed log of everything that happened in and around the house, documenting cars that drove past, neighbors who walked their dogs, delivery trucks that stopped on the street, airplanes that flew overhead. The log grew thicker every day, filled with observations that to anyone else would have seemed mundane, but to Mitchell represented pieces of a vast surveillance operation. Karen Mitchell was terrified, not of her husband, but of what was happening to him. She'd tried talking to him, tried convincing him to see a doctor, but David refused, insisting that there was nothing wrong with him, that he was thinking more clearly than he ever had, that everyone else was blind to what was happening. She'd called David's brother, Michael, who lived in Philadelphia, and Michael had driven down to try to talk to David in person. The conversation had gone nowhere. Michael had urged David to seek help, had expressed concern that the things David was describing didn't align with reality, and David had responded by suggesting that the people watching him would try to make him seem mentally ill, would try to isolate him by turning his family against him. Michael had left frustrated and frightened, telling Karen that she needed to get David to a hospital, that this was serious, that he wasn't going to get better on his own. Karen had called the hospital in late August, explaining the situation to a nurse who'd told her that unless David posed an immediate danger to himself or others, she couldn't force him into treatment. The nurse had suggested she try to convince David to see a psychiatrist voluntarily and gave her a list of resources. But Karen knew David would never agree to it. He believed the problem was external. He believed he was under attack. And that belief had become so deeply rooted that nothing she said could shake it. On September 3rd, Mitchell filed his 17th and final report with the FBI. He called the Washington field office and told the agent who answered that the situation had reached a critical point. He'd detected multiple signs of escalated surveillance over the past week. He'd heard footsteps on the roof at night. He'd seen shadows moving past the windows. He'd noticed scratches on the exterior walls near the electrical meter, suggesting someone had tampered with the power supply. His daughter had told him that a man in a dark suit had been standing across the street from her school, watching the children during recess. Mitchell had gone to the school to investigate, but by the time he arrived, the man was gone. He told the FBI agent that he believed an operation against him was imminent, that all the preliminary surveillance had been building to this moment, and that he needed protection. The agent asked Mitchell if he was safe and if his family was safe. Mitchell said he didn't know any more, but that he was taking precautions, that he was doing everything he could to protect his family. The agent tried to keep Mitchell on the line, tried to assess his mental state, but Mitchell said he had to go, that he couldn't stay on the phone too long. And then he hung up. The agent immediately contacted his supervisor, who reviewed Mitchell's case file and made the decision to alert local police and recommend a welfare check. By the time that decision was made, it was already too late. In the days following that final call, David Mitchell's behavior became increasingly erratic. Karen later told investigators that he'd stopped sleeping entirely, spending his nights moving from room to room, checking windows, examining walls, listening for sounds that only he could hear. He'd begun talking to himself, carrying on one-sided conversations about patterns and signals. He'd stopped eating regular meals, subsisting on whatever he could grab quickly from the refrigerator, crackers and cold cuts consumed standing up, while he continued his surveillance of the house and the street outside. His appearance had deteriorated. He hadn't shaved in over a week. His clothes were rumpled and stained. His eyes were sunken and ringed with dark circles. On September 4th, the day after his final FBI report, Mitchell had driven to a hardware store and purchased a crowbar, a sledgehammer, several screwdrivers, and a high-powered flashlight. Karen had asked him what he needed the tools for, and he'd told her he was going to do what the FBI couldn't or wouldn't do, that he was going to find the proof himself, that he was going to expose the surveillance operation once and for all. Karen had felt a chill run through her when he said this, a deep instinctive sense that something terrible was about to happen. But she didn't know what to do. She'd already called the hospital. She'd already talked to his brother. She'd already tried everything she could think of to get David help, and nothing had worked. Over the next day and a half, Mitchell's paranoia intensified to levels that frightened even him. He'd begun to believe that the Soviets knew he was onto them, that they were preparing to make their move before he could expose the operation. He'd told Karen on the evening of September 5th that he needed to act quickly, that time was running out, that if he didn't find the evidence soon, it would be too late. Karen had barely slept that night, lying awake, listening to David pace the house, hearing him muttering to himself, occasionally hearing the sound of furniture being moved as he checked behind bookcases and under rugs. By morning, she was exhausted and terrified, and when David told her he'd be spending the day conducting a thorough search of the house, she'd made the decision to take Emily out for the day, to give David space, and to protect their daughter from whatever was about to unfold. Karen Mitchell left the house at 10 o'clock that morning. David had been in the garage when they left, examining the tools he'd laid out on his workbench. She'd asked him if he was okay, if he needed anything. His voice had been calm, almost eerily so, as if he'd reached some kind of decision that had eluded him for months. Karen had felt uneasy leaving him alone. She returned home 3 hours later, at 1:15 in the afternoon. The front door was ajar, which immediately set off alarm bells in her mind, because David had been obsessive about locking the door every single time anyone entered or left. She pushed it open and called out for David. No response. She stepped inside, and what she saw made her stop breathing. The living room was unrecognizable. The walls had been torn apart. Massive sections of drywall ripped away and discarded in jagged chunks across the floor. The studs were exposed, raw wood beams standing like ribs in a carcass, and between them, wiring hung loose. Some of it pulled free from its anchors, some of it still connected, but dangling in loops. The ceiling had been partially demolished, sections of it pulled down to reveal insulation and ductwork, and white dust covered everything, coating the furniture, the floor, the windows, like snow. The couch had been dragged away from the wall, and behind it, more drywall had been removed, leaving a gaping cavity that stretched from floor to ceiling. Light fixtures had been torn out of the ceiling, leaving exposed electrical boxes and loose wires. Baseboards had been pried off and tossed aside. Sections of carpet had been pulled up, revealing the subfloor beneath. Karen walked through the living room in a daze, her shoes crunching on debris, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She moved into the dining room and found the same devastation. The built-in china cabinet had been ripped out of the wall, leaving a raw hole. The chandelier had been taken down and lay on its side on the table, which was covered in plaster dust and chunks of drywall. The kitchen was worse. Cabinet doors hung open, their contents scattered across the counters and floor. The wall behind the sink had been torn open, exposing pipes and more wiring. The backsplash tiles had been pried off, leaving adhesive residue and broken fragments. The refrigerator had been pulled away from the wall, and the drywall behind it had been demolished. Karen's hands were shaking. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, could hear the blood rushing in her ears. She called David's name again, louder this time, her voice cracking with fear and desperation. From somewhere upstairs, she heard movement. She climbed the stairs slowly. The hallway upstairs had been torn apart. Family photos that had hung on the walls were lying on the floor, their frames broken. The walls themselves were marked with holes where David had punched through the drywall. She moved toward the master bedroom, where the sounds were coming from, and pushed open the door. David was in the center of the room, surrounded by destruction. The walls had been stripped down to the studs. The closet had been emptied, the clothes piled on the bed, which had been shoved into the corner of the room. The flooring had been torn up in sections, exposing the subfloor. And in the middle of it all, covered head to toe in white plaster dust and sweat, his hair wild, his eyes bloodshot and wide, was her husband. He was holding a crowbar in one hand and a flashlight in the other. He was wearing the same clothes he'd been wearing that morning, but they were filthy, torn, streaked with dust and grime. His hands were bleeding from multiple cuts, raw and red, but he didn't seem to notice or care. When Karen said his name, he looked up at her, and the expression on his face was something she would never forget. It was triumph mixed with terror, vindication mixed with desperation. He looked like a man who had finally found proof of something unspeakable. He told her he'd found them, found where they were. The microphones, the transmitters, all of it had been in the walls, and no one had believed him. But now he had evidence. He gestured around the room with the crowbar, pointing to scratches on the studs, marks that he claimed were drill holes where equipment had been installed. He pointed to a piece of wiring hanging from the ceiling, insisting it wasn't part of the house's electrical system, that it had been run through the walls to power surveillance devices. Karen looked at the wire. It was just a wire, part of the electrical system. Nothing unusual, nothing sinister. She looked at the scratches on the studs, which could have been made by anything, by construction workers when the house was built, by previous owners, by the natural settling of the structure over decades. She looked at her husband, at the wild conviction in his eyes, at the bleeding hands and the filthy clothes and the destroyed room, and she understood that David was gone. Not physically, but mentally. He had crossed some invisible threshold, and he wasn't coming back. She told him there was nothing there, that he'd torn the house apart, but there was nothing there. David's voice rose as he insisted they'd taken it, that they'd known he was getting close, and had come back to remove the equipment, but the evidence was still there. The drill holes, the scratches, the extra wiring. He insisted she just had to know what to look for. Karen stepped toward him, her hands raised, palms out, as if approaching a wounded animal. She told him he needed help, that they needed to go to the hospital, that doctors would help him feel better. David's expression changed. The triumph faded, replaced by suspicion. He said they'd gotten to her. That's why she was saying this, that they'd gotten to her. And now she was trying to make him think he was crazy. Karen shook her head, tears streaming down her face, insisting she loved him and was trying to help. David backed away, saying she was trying to make him stop looking. That's what they wanted, for him to stop, to give up, to let his guard down. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. He said there was more. There had to be more. He just hadn't found it yet. He turned back to the wall and raised the crowbar, smashing it into the remaining drywall with a force that sent chunks flying across the room. Karen flinched, tears streaming down her face, and then she turned and ran downstairs, grabbing the phone in the kitchen and dialing 911 with shaking hands. The police arrived within 10 minutes, along with paramedics. They found David in the bedroom, still tearing at the walls, still searching for evidence that didn't exist. It took 3 officers to restrain him, not because he was violent, but because he fought them with a desperate, manic strength, shouting that they were making a mistake, that he needed more time, that he was so close to finding the truth. They handcuffed him and led him out of the house, still shouting, still struggling, and Karen stood in the driveway, watching as her husband was put into an ambulance and driven away. David Mitchell was admitted to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, a psychiatric facility in Washington, D.C., on the afternoon of September 6, 1981. He was diagnosed with acute paranoid schizophrenia, with persecutory delusions, a severe and debilitating mental illness characterized by the unshakable belief that he was being persecuted by external forces. Over the following days, as psychiatrists attempted to evaluate and stabilize him, it became clear that David's break from reality was profound and potentially irreversible. He told the doctors that the FBI had investigated his reports but had failed because Soviet intelligence had covered their tracks too well. He insisted that the destruction of his house had been necessary, that he'd found evidence of surveillance equipment, and that the only reason the devices weren't there anymore was because the operatives had removed them before the authorities arrived. When doctors suggested that perhaps no one had ever been watching him, that the surveillance had been a delusion, David became agitated and hostile, accusing the staff of being part of the conspiracy, of trying to discredit him so that his warnings would be ignored. His condition deteriorated rapidly. Within 2 weeks, he'd stopped speaking in coherent sentences, his thoughts fragmenting into disjointed phrases about watchers and listeners and shadows on the walls. He believed the other patients in the ward were Soviet agents, placed there to monitor him. He believed the doctors were conducting experiments on him, trying to extract information or break his will. He refused to eat, convinced the food was poisoned. He refused to sleep, terrified that someone would attack him while he was unconscious. The medical staff tried multiple antipsychotic medications, but David's response was poor, and his paranoia only deepened. By November, David Mitchell had been moved to a secure wing of the hospital, a section reserved for patients who posed a danger to themselves or others. He'd attacked a staff member, not out of malice, but out of terror, believing the staff member was reaching for a weapon when he'd simply been trying to administer medication. David was placed in a padded isolation room, a small, windowless space where he could be monitored constantly and where he couldn't hurt himself or anyone else. He spent hours pacing the room, muttering to himself, occasionally shouting at people who weren't there. He scratched at the padded walls, convinced there were listening devices hidden beneath the fabric. He covered his ears when staff members spoke to him, insisting he could hear coded messages in their words. Karen visited him in December, bringing Emily with her because she thought seeing his daughter might bring him back, might pierce through the delusions and remind him of who he'd been. But when they entered the visiting room and David was brought in, restrained and heavily sedated, he looked at Karen with empty, fearful eyes and asked who she was, why she was there, what she wanted from him. Emily started crying, and Karen had to carry her out of the room, both of them sobbing, while David was led back to his cell, still asking questions that made no sense. The doctors told Karen that David's prognosis was poor. The schizophrenia was severe and treatment-resistant, and the likelihood of meaningful recovery was minimal. They recommended that Karen consider long-term institutional care, that she begin making arrangements for a future in which David would not be coming home. In January of 1982, after petitions and evaluations under District of Columbia civil commitment law, a court ordered David's continued hospitalization, which Karen supported and signed associated paperwork for. And then she drove home to the house that David had destroyed, the house she was slowly trying to repair, where she cried for hours, mourning the loss of the man she'd married, the man who no longer existed. David Mitchell spent the next 18.5 years at St. Elizabeth's. He never left the secure wing. He never regained coherent speech. He never stopped believing that Soviet operatives were watching him, that the staff were complicit, that his family had been replaced by imposters. He existed in a reality that no one else could see, trapped inside a nightmare that had no end. Karen divorced him in 1984, not out of anger, but out of necessity, needing to move forward with her life. She remarried in 1988. Emily grew up, went to college, and built a life as far removed from those events as she could manage. Neither of them visited David after that first attempt in December 1981. David Mitchell died on March 14, 2000, at the age of 56, from complications related to pneumonia. He'd remained in a secure wing for nearly 2 decades, often isolated in a padded room, his mind so fractured that he could no longer feed himself, no longer control his bodily functions, no longer do anything but exist in a state of constant, unrelenting terror. The hospital notified Karen, who told Emily, and they held a small, private funeral with no service and no mourners except the two of them. David's obituary was 3 sentences long, mentioning only that he'd been a Pentagon employee and a veteran. There was no mention of the surveillance reports, the FBI investigations, the destroyed house, or the 19 years spent locked away in a psychiatric institution. The FBI closed its file on David Mitchell, concluding after a comprehensive review that he had filed 17 separate reports alleging surveillance by foreign intelligence, that every report had been thoroughly investigated, and that no evidence of surveillance had ever been found. The agents who'd worked his case later described it as one of the most troubling they'd encountered, not because of any actual threat, but because of how completely and utterly convinced Mitchell had been, and how tragic it was to watch a man destroy himself fighting an enemy that existed nowhere but in his own mind. The human mind, when it breaks, doesn't always break cleanly, and paranoid schizophrenia is one of the cruelest ways it can fracture, because it creates a reality so vivid and so terrifying that no amount of evidence, no intervention, and no love can pull the sufferer back. David Mitchell's story is a reminder that the most dangerous threats we face are sometimes the ones we create ourselves, and that once the line between reality and delusion dissolves, there may be no way to restore it, leaving behind only the wreckage of a life that might have been.